Hey everybody, this is Charles Raether. Today I wanted to do a deep dive into a topic that very often comes up in the E-2 context. What is better, doing a startup business that the proprietor starts up on their own or acquiring a franchise? And this often really affects the thinking and the whole preparation of the E-2 and the investment work, et cetera, of the client. So something I wanted to talk about a little bit today in more detail to help you get a better idea of what are the pros and cons of each approach. There's a little spoiler warning here. The short answer is, well, maybe you better watch the end of the video to find out. And so what's better necessarily from an E-2 context? Starting up your own business or using a franchise? As you can imagine, there are definitely advantages to a franchise. It has a proven business model, has lower risk involved generally, probably because this is a model that's been replicated dozens, if not hundreds of times. They have everything, calculated out. Supply chains are all put into place. All the numbers and calculations are ready. So in that regards, a franchise does have a lower risk profile than if you were starting up your own business from scratch. If you look at the general statistics as well, probably people that started a franchise after 2 or 3 years, the percentage of businesses that are continuing to operate are generally probably higher as a franchise than if it was just a startup business on your own. In addition, you're also able to acquire support from the franchisor and team. So you'd have support in terms of the training, product development, marketing, and other aspects. So these two can also play a role in making your decision. Of course, if you're looking at building your own business, there are certainly pros and cons to that. First thing is you're not limited at all by any kind of franchise agreement, what you want to sell, how you want to sell it, what you want to do. You really have complete freedom. In addition, that creates greater upside for you, right? You don't have to pay these royalty payments, licensing fees. You're not obligated to acquire product and inventory from certain suppliers, and they all take their cut, and prices might be a little bit inflated because you're purchasing from these stipulated vendors as opposed to doing this all on your own. But of course, where there's more risk, there's also more work. So, you have the opportunity to make more with your own personal business, but also the risk is probably a little bit higher as well because you don't have the support necessarily of a franchise network, a franchisor, and other players. Probably from the E-2 perspective, probably the biggest advantage of starting up your own business is the lower cost. Now, it depends on what business you're looking at doing, but it's not inaccurate to say that on average, if you're starting up your own business, you're going to need to invest less money at the outset than if you are acquiring a franchise. That's not always necessarily a good thing, right? But if you're looking purely from the perspective of how much money do I have to commit and invest, 9 times out of 10, comparing apples to apples, the amount of money that's going to be required for your own business is going to be less than what you would need to pay for a franchise. So for many people, that consideration alone is enough for them to choose to go with their own business. Oftentimes with E-2 visas, especially if it's the first filing, they want to minimize their downside and minimize their risk. And if you have to invest, say, $150,000 into a franchise to acquire a business that's going to generate the same cash flow than if you only had to invest, say, $90,000 or $100,000 in your own business, a lot of times clients will just prefer to go with that smaller investment amount. Maybe their upside is limited because they're investing less in their own company and they're going to be earning less. But I think for most E-2 investors that at that first stage, initially at least, their goal is not maximizing profit, it's minimizing risk. And so in those cases, very often you're able to minimize your risk probably by investing in your own business. But again, that's not always necessarily the case. Because if you do consider a franchise model, there certainly are some benefits to a franchise model, especially if you don't have access to the US. So what do I mean by that? We often have clients who are looking to do an E-2 visa, but they don't have the ability to come and visit the US. For example, they don't qualify for ESTA, so they need a visa, but they don't have a tourist visa. Maybe they've been denied a tourist visa in the past. So they're not able to physically come here to the US to help get the business set up, find the office space, open the bank account, make initial negotiations with suppliers here and potential partners. So if you're in that category where you're not able to come to the US in that prep time prior to the E-2 filing, you might be a very, very good candidate for a franchise just because the logistics required of setting everything up are just too daunting without having a physical presence here. Whereas if you are acquiring a franchise, the board and their staff can obviously do a lot of the work for you remotely while you're, overseas. So that is one scenario where it's quite possible acquiring a franchise is the best option, and it might actually be only the only option that realistically exists in certain circumstances. So if we go through the major categories when making a consideration about an E-2 business, we can kind of compare the pros and cons of independent or direct business or franchise. So we covered a lot of these, but some of them we didn't, and we can do a little review as well. The first issue I wanted to bring up is the investment amount. Again, as I mentioned, with a franchise, it tends to be higher than with your own personal investment. Brand recognition. You're always going to get more brand recognition through a franchise than your own proprietary business. From an E-2 perspective, I'm not so sure that's always that important, but I would have to say that probably officers are probably a little bit more positively predisposed towards franchises than independent businesses if the business has no income, no history, hasn't been operating. Because at least generally with a franchise, theoretically, you've got the support of the franchisor, their whole network, that you've got more support than you would with your own individual business. And for that reason, I think sometimes maybe officers lean more positively towards a franchise structure. In terms of risk level, like I said, with a franchise, the risk level is lower. With your own independent business, it's higher. At the same time, the flip side of that is what is the upside that's available for you. With your own business, the upside is less limited. You could say probably the sky's the limit. Whereas with a franchise, there are greater limitations on the upside, greater expenses, and greater limitations on your ability to run the business as you please. At the end of the day, what is the better option for an E-2? Ironically, you might be surprised by this, but I would say there really is no one best option for everybody. Looking at the number of clients we've had over the last 20 years, I would still say the majority have invested in their own business. So I would say it is definitely a small minority who selects to use a franchise. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, but for whatever reason, our clients, and it's true regardless of citizenship, whether they're Canadian, Brits, clients from Eastern Europe, the vast majority choose to develop their own business. And so I think that just, is reflective of maybe the general sentiment, but what might be the best option for you really could depend on your individual circumstances, and your situation might be very different from the quote unquote average. And for that reason, there might be circumstances, and maybe your case is one of them, where a franchise probably is the preferable way to go, even though the majority might not select that. So if you're looking at an E-2 and trying to resolve some of these issues, which way to go, franchise, personal investment, or even looking at some other visa options, please reach out to us in order that we could assist you and your family in making that decision and having a successful transition.